Hello and welcome. Take a look at this map. It shows Italy's GDP by region. In other words, how strong the economy is in different parts of the country. Notice anything? Here's another one. This time it's the Human Development Index, basically how well people live. And you know what? Almost any map of the Italy looks same. Population, unemployment, average salaries, religiousness, voter turnout, English proficiency. It's always that clear split between north and south. Italy is practically divided in two. The north, in some ways, competes with the world's top economies, and the south. Sometimes it looks like poor African regions. People even say Italy is actually two countries flying the same flag. Because really, in Europe, there is no other country with such a sharp internal divide. And it's been this way for hundreds, even thousands of years. But how did it get like this? Well, this is the story of how Italy accidentally became one country. How the divide between North and South gave us many of things we now associate with Italy. And how the country is still living with that divide today. It's actually kind of funny. Everyone knows what Italy looks like, the famous boot shape. But these borders, total accident, and the whole history of the place shaped why the north and south are so different. Modern Italy is only about 160 years old. That's not a lot. Coca-Cola was invented around the same time. Before that, there was no Italy. No one even thought about it. In Europe, people used to say Italy the same way you'd say the Balkans or the Pyrenees. Just a geographic term. That's what they called the peninsula. And honestly, this peninsula wasn't exactly a great place to build a country. Even Napoleon complained that Italy was too long. Italy's coastline is actually longer than Chile's. You just can't guard all of it. The country can be attacked from 3 different continents. So people living there basically had 2 options. Either strike first or get attacked. The first option, that was the Roman Empire. They really did conquer everything they could, including uniting this entire peninsula. But eventually, the Roman Empire collapsed. And after that, for 1,000 years, Italy became a total patchwork. Pretty much anyone who had an army came there. Vikings, Arabs, Turks, Germans, French, Austrians, even Americans eventually. But none of them ever controlled the whole peninsula. That's exactly why Italy has no historic borders. And there wasn't just one people here either. It was more like waves of migrants from Africa, Asia, Arab world, Eastern Europe, Greece. They all came here for one simple reason, because it was easy to get there. And spoiler, that's still happening today. I'll come back to that part later. But back then, say around 11th century, people living in what's now Italy couldn't even understand each other. There were something like 40 different languages spoken across the land. Italian as a language didn't even exist. And as for Italians, that concept wasn't a thing at all. So yeah, for about 1,000 years, Italy was like a giant melting pot. Dozens of nationalities, mini-states, foreign rulers, all mixed together. People used to call it the most fragmented place in Europe, maybe even in the whole world. Now, you might think, okay, so what? Lots of places had diverse populations and still became unified nations eventually. Fair point. Look at France, for example. Same idea. But the thing is, in Italy, all of that happened with a serious delay, like centuries late. And once again, the reason was geography. But this time the geography inside the country. Sure, getting into Italy was easy, but moving around within Italy, That was a nightmare. People forget, but Italy is seriously mountainous. You got the Alps in the north, the Apennines running all the way down the peninsula. They're not the tallest mountains in Europe, but they're incredibly inconvenient, full of ravines, gorges and steep terrain. Crossing the Apennines was, and still, a pain. If you've ever done a road trip through Italy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Eventually, these mountains would turn out to be helpful, but back in the Middle Ages, they made unifying the territory almost impossible. Not just politically, but mentally too. People from neighboring villages might have known nothing about each other and never even met. The whole peninsula was split into a bunch of tiny kingdoms, often ruled by foreign powers, each going its own way. And this is where the first real differences between North and South start to show. The South, honestly, it didn't get the best deal. It's much hotter down there and the land isn't all that fertile. Earthquakes are pretty common in southern Italy, and on top of that, they've had volcanoes to deal with. Just so you know, if we're talking continental Europe, not counting islands, Italy is the only country with active volcanoes. Since the country came into existence, 4 of them have erupted. You've probably heard the story of Pompeii when Mount Vesuvius wiped out the entire thriving city. But that's ancient history. What most people don't know is that Vesuvius erupted again in 17th century, and thousands of people died in Naples. So while the great empires of the time were conquering India and Americas, people in southern Italy were still dealing with the basics, like survival. Now, the north was a totally different story. Technically, the northern part of modern Italy isn't even a peninsula, and it had a whole different setup. First of all, this huge flat area called the Po Valley, and this is the main reason the north ended up so wealthy. The Po Valley is the largest lowland area in southern Europe. Just picture this, it's actually bigger than the entire Netherlands. The Po River runs through the plain with tons of little streams feeding into it. It made travel easy, opened up trade routes and was perfect for building cities. Down south, barely any rivers at all, but north there were meadows, forests, basically an ideal spot. And honestly, a lot of countries and regions that became powerful back then did so simply because of where they were on the map. Geography really was destiny. Even the tall mountains in the north wasn't a problem. In fact, they gave the area a mild climate, and surprisingly, it's actually easier to cross the Alps than Apennine. So while the north had every possible condition for growth and trade with the rest of Europe, the south was just isolated. Sometimes it functioned, sometimes it just tried to survive, and that's how it went for centuries. So here's the big question. How did all of this eventually became one country? Weirdly enough, the answer is Napoleon. In the early 1800s, he basically took over all the Europe, including almost all of Italy. So when he said Italy was too long, well, he had first-hand experience. Out of all those endless little states, Napoleon created 3 larger ones. And no, he didn't do it for Italians. He just needed things to be simpler, he could run empire more easily. He had zero interest in independent Italy. But still, Napoleon was the first person to show the locals that life could be actually different. He brought in a constitution, introduced some form of elections, promoted the idea of legal equality, and most importantly, he brought the spirit of the French Revolution. And suddenly, the people living there, the future Italians, saw that their land didn't have to be split into a dozen tiny territories ruled by foreigners. If Napoleon could turn the peninsula into 3 states, then why not 1? Of course, Napoleon wasn't some liberator or democratic hero. But he did blow up the old system, and once people saw that, they didn't want to go back, especially since after Napoleon was defeated, the victorious powers basically restored the old patchwork of kingdoms. Most of them ended up under Austrian control, all except one, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. And that's exactly where the unification of Italy would begin. Piedmont turned out to be a pretty successful and wealthy state. It had everything the advanced countries of that time had: a constitution, free trade, even industry. Oh, and this was their flag. But more than that, they had big ambitions. After the Napoleonic Wars, revolutions and uprisings were breaking out all across Europe. Entire nations were fed up with how their borders had been drawn. In Italy, these uprisings didn't stop for decades. Secret societies were forming, underground parties popping up. The problem? None of these young revolutionaries wanted to work together. They didn't have a common goal, and they definitely didn't see themselves as one people. Their main enemy wasn't fragmentation, it was Austria. Piedmont fought Austria, but not to reunite Italy. They just wanted to grab a bit more territory. Still, some neighboring states voluntarily chose to join Piedmont for protection. Then came the perfect opportunity. Protests erupted in Sicily. Piedmont's top general, Garibaldi, sailed over, took Sicily and then Naples, and then even captured the Pope's territory. Yeah, the Pope used to have more than just a Vatican. He ruled over an entire state. And honestly, that's another reason why Italy stayed divided for so long. How do you unify a country when the Pope's kingdom is sitting right across the middle of it? But in the end, it was the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia that did the unifying. The king became the first king of Italy. Today, we call all of this the Wars of Independence. There were actually 3 of them. Alliances kept shifting. Who was fighting whom, which empire supported which side. It was all about short-term strategy and gains. No one had some noble master plan to create Italy. And you can totally see that when you look at the map. Like, there's zero logic to Sardinia being part of the Italy, while Corsica is part of France. Or how Nice and Monaco used to belong to Piedmont, but ended up French because of backroom deals. Oh, and 2 more examples of how just messy things were. The Vatican and San Marino. I'll tell their stories some other time. San Marino, by the way, has this really wild history, and that's why this tiny little state still exists right in the middle of Italy. So there it was. In the 19th century, the first time since the Roman Empire, the Italian peninsula finally had a single unified country. And it was even called Italy. Problem solved, right? Time to develop all the regions equally and erase those old boundaries. No. Italy turned out to be a pretty unstable country. Right away, it became clear just how many problems it was going to face and how hard it would to be manage a territory that had spent centuries being divided. Keep it in mind, the Industrial Revolution was already in full swing around the world, and in northern Italy things were going okay. That region had been growing alongside the rest of the Europe for ages. You had wealthy Piedmont, and just recently Austrian influence had brought in infrastructure and system. But the south, it was seriously behind. People there mostly worked in agriculture, many lived in poverty, and a large part of the population couldn't even read or write. On top of that, the north felt like they were the ones who unified the country. They had done the work. They were building the new state. Technically, this wasn't even a merger. It was more like an annexation. Sure, they held referendums in the newly added regions. But let's be real, 99% of voters said yes. It was the 19th century after all. So what ended up happening is that the North had to set up all the rules for the new Italy. And the money that flowed north too. For example, to cover all costs of the war, Piedmont raised taxes, but only in the southern territories. And that didn't help them catch up. It only deepened the divide. The new Italy didn't even have one common language. People from Milan and Sicily could barely understand each other. And yeah, that definitely gets in the way of building a real national identity. But over time, things changed. And today, Italians are genuinely proud to be Italian. What helped spark that change? Italian culture, opera, theater, literature. One of the most influential books in the young nation turned to be Pinocchio. Yeah, really. And believe it or not, it had way more politics than you might think. Its author, Carlo Collodi, was a soldier who had fought in the war for Italian independence. He deeply cared about the future of this fragile new country, and he believed Italy would only truly unite once the next generation grew up. So he tried to pass on his values through a story for children. That tale about a wooden puppet turning into a real boy. It's actually a metaphor about how the kids in that time needed to become real Italians. They had to study, learn the language, became citizens of a unified nation. The book was written in the Tuscan dialect, the one that would later become the foundation of modern Italian. So, children across the country were reading the same story, learning the same language, and slowly becoming a single people. Pinocchio helped Italy find its national identity. Who would have thought? And there is one more thing that came directly out of Italy's instability and the whole North-South divide. You know it well. In the earlier years of unified Italy, the government was weak. The police force was tiny and enforcing order was nearly impossible, especially in the south, especially in remote villages. At one point there were just 1,000 police officers for whole Sicily. So people started taking the law into their own hands, and after centuries of foreign rule, most Italians didn't trust the authorities anyway. So locals settled conflicts themselves and weren't afraid to use force when needed. Add to that widespread poverty. And suddenly, the fastest way to rise up in society was organized crime. That's how the Mafia started in southern Italy. Later on, when many Italians migrated to the United States in search of better life, they took the concept with them. Meanwhile, the South suffered from that wave of emigration. Entire families left, especially the younger generation. But all the problems facing young Italy, especially in the South, ended up leading to a whole new chapter of country's history. What was this situation like? Power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. Corruption was everywhere, and there were no meaningful reforms. Regular people completely lost faith in politics. And a lot of Italians started hoping that someone, anyone, would come in and take control with a firm hand. Then World War I hit and only made things worse. Technically, Italy fought on the side of winners, but in the end, it didn't really gain anything. It just lost money and lives. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home and there were no jobs waiting for them. Against this backdrop, a man named Benito Mussolini founded a fascist party. Mussolini talked a lot about Italy's former greatness, which was kind of ironic because at that point Italy had existed for 50 years, so he leans on a mix of imagery. Heroes from the independence wars, like Garibaldi, and of course the Roman Empire. It was a strange combo, but his main promise, he would bring order. And that's how by the time World War II came around, Italy was fighting on the side of Nazi Germany. The two countries actually had a lot in common back then. Italy and Germany was both young nations. Both had been born from the collapse of divided kingdoms. Neither had managed to recover from World War I, and both had grown dissatisfied with their own governments. And you probably know what happened next, but what's interesting is how differently the two countries were treated afterwards. Germany was split into separate states. The border that divided them, honestly, it was pretty artificial. But Italy, which was already deeply divided internally, stayed whole. Why? Because no one saw Italy as the same threat as Germany was, and because there were no Soviet troops on Italian soil. So the United States and Britain didn't need to share. Remember how I said earlier that Italy's tricky geography would actually come in handy at some point? Well, that moment was World War II, because the Allies spent 2 whole years trying to capture the peninsula. And one of the reasons it was so hard, it is long, mountainous and tough to navigate. So after the war, Italy remained in one piece. But the whole country was in ruins. It had been bombed heavily. And for the Western powers, it became a top priority to help Italy rebuild and to turn it into a strong, stable ally. That's why Italy received massive loans through the Marshall Plan, just slightly less than what West Germany got. But inside the country, that money wasn't spread out evenly. The priority was to rebuild industry, and guess where most of it was? In the north. So this created a downward cycle. Life in the north kept improving, which attracted even more people from the south. Those people helped the economy grow even more, and the inequality, which was already obvious before the war, only got worse. Now, to be fair, it's not like the south got nothing. There were special programs, grants, financial aid, and in some ways that really did help. New roads were built, tourism started to thrive, but the starting conditions were just way too unequal. And on top of that, the old mindset stuck around. Deep mistrust in the government and corruption in the south that refused to go away. What happened in Italy after the war is often called an economic miracle. Money started flowing in, factories were rebuilt, and all sorts of new companies and brands began to pop up. Italy joined NATO, even though it had a really strong socialist party. That party got a lot of voters in elections, but they never actually came to power. And just to be clear, these weren't the same kind of socialists you'd find in East Germany. Eventually, Italy became an important part of the Western world, and even one of the founding members of the European Union. Today, it's the third largest economy in Europe. But there's one thing. People often say it's actually two economies, two different countries flying the same flag. Up north, there's wealth, industry, investment, competition, better services, higher salaries, and an overall stronger quality of life. Down south, things are still heavily dependent on agriculture. Unemployment is high and incomes are well below European average. So this problem, the one that started 1,000 years ago, rooted in geography after the fall of Roman Empire, it hasn't gone away. Italians call it the questione meridionale, the southern question, and it's still one of the biggest puzzles in Italian politics. Naturally, people in the south aren't happy about any of this. They feel like the government isn't doing enough and can't solve their problems. Meanwhile, up in the north, many believe the south is dragging the country down, that Southerns don't work, don't contribute, and just live off financial aid. Now, maybe those are just stereotypes, but they still affect everyday life in Italy, including politics. For a long time, the industrial north landed to vote for right-wing parties that promised to support businesses. The South, on the other hand, often leaned left or backed parties that focused on religion and social welfare. But it all changed just a couple of years ago when the Brothers of Italy party won the national elections. And yes, historically that party has ties to Mussolini. Fratelli d'Italia is a right-wing party, and surprisingly, it gains a lot of support in the South. Their leader, Giorgia Meloni, is now the Prime Minister of Italy. She didn't talk much about the Southern question. Instead, she presented herself as a leader for all Italians. And she shifted the national conversation toward external issues. One of the biggest? Migration. Remember how I said earlier that the South was always been landing point for migrants? Well, in recent years, the issue has become especially urgent. Italy is even planning to house illegal migrants in Albania. They've built a special detention center there just for this purpose. So now that old rich North versus poor South narrative gradually shifting into something else, more like all Italians versus outside threats. And the South, after decades of being let down by the government, responded well to promises of law and order. All in all, the story of how and why Italy is divided is a fascinating example of how geography and history shape a country's present and its future. Now, of course, it's important to be fair. Yes, the South has high unemployment. Yes, the wages are low. And the infrastructure isn't great. But it's not like these regions are completely underdeveloped. If you go back to the maps I mentioned at the beginning, you'll see the quality of life is lower on the South, sure, but still, the numbers are about par with countries like Argentina, Chile or Turkey. So it's not disastrous. Italy is still third largest economy in Europe. Even the poor regions aren't doing that badly. It just depends on what you compare them to. And maybe that alone shows us something. Even if Italy is divided, even if it's always been divided for hundreds or even thousands of years, today somehow they're still making it work. Italy was never meant to be one country, and yet here it is, built out of old kingdoms, deep divisions and unexpected turns. It somehow became something whole. Maybe every country is like that, not a finished idea, but a work in progress. So the real question is, how do you keep something together when it was never truly one to begin with? Thank you. Good night.